Hi there. Welcome to this next panel. This is panel brainstorm addressing physical risks in complex supply chains. I'm Kathy Boffman-McLeod, the director of the Adrienne Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center at the Atlantic Council. And our mission is to build the human capacity for resilience in the face of climate change. Very pleased to be your moderator here today. And to introduce our panelists, we're going to crack right on, and we will not do introductions, so please find more on these panelists in the materials for today's session. So first we have Chris Edery, Director of Corporate Sustainability at Dell Technologies. Next we have Lindsell Harris, who is the Senior Vice President, Global Supply Chain and Strategy at AstraZeneca. We have Kirsty McIntyre, Sustainability Director and Global Supply and Procurement at Diageo. And it's Louis, but he goes by Lou Gritzo, Vice President and Manager of Research at FM Global. So welcome to all of you from your time zones. And I suppose this is North America, so we probably don't have as big a range as usual for the global events. But we're going to have a snappy, fun conversation, and the whole idea is to take away a few new things and look at some different perspectives around supply chain management and climate with COVID, and to explore some ways that things are being done in the face of all the things that are facing our companies and us and our communities. So let me start with Chris and say, you've said that all sectors are now sensitive to climate due to the pivot in the collective level of importance that we're seeing for climate in the last 12 months. And I wanted to ask you to talk about that for a minute and tell us why you see all sectors, not any particulars.
Well, thanks very much, Kathy. So I think everyone who's participating at this conference will see that the paradigm on sustainability has really shifted in the last 12 months, where sustainability has almost become one of the table stakes that we need to look at as a business, rather than seeing it more as a nice to have. I mean, I've been fortunate to work in sustainability since the early 2000s. And I know at that time, especially when we're engaging in the major international associations in this field, like the WBCSD, I was working within the building materials sector. We also had representatives from power generators and steel manufacturers. And I think that was the kind of core of people who were driving on things, because the carbon footprints of those types of sectors are so large. But now we only need to look at the types of participation that's in this conference to see how that paradigm has really shifted. And I think from my perspective, I see a number of drivers that have helped make that happen. Part of it is that increased desire and expectation around disclosure. We also see a huge change in the regulatory regimes that sit around this field, as well as increased expectation from customers and stakeholders in terms of being able to perform and provide products and solutions and services that are made in a responsible fashion. So, I see this as an issue to be tackled by right across different sectors, rather than it being a niche and more relevant to one more than the other.
Yeah, I think table stakes is the word to take from that. I couldn't agree more. Let me turn to Lindsell from AstraZeneca and ask about coronavirus and how in your supply chain and in your sector you've got climate risk management in the supply chain, and then you have coronavirus that kerfuffles the whole thing, I'm guessing. Could tell us about that and how are you handling that?
Yeah, Kathy, it's interesting for us because obviously for some of the people who may know AstraZeneca, we were in the pursuit of delivering vaccines to combat the virus at the same time as we were delivering the rest of our medicines to patients. The impact of the pandemic is fascinating, because what you actually see is that the risk and the challenges become exacerbated. So at the end of the day, within the pandemic, you may have logistics disruptions and you may have a climate risk challenge at the same time. that just extends lead times, extends the time it takes to respond to a patient need. We also saw significant demand fluctuations by market, by product, depending on access to hospitals, access to the different medicines, the regimens. So when you add the pandemic uh, variability of demand per region, per country, to the expansive supply chains, it really highlights the need from a supply chain management perspective of one, being proactive. Number two is being connected. The connectivity and the transparency of where the risk may lie, whether it's climate or other environmental challenges, just became paramount. And you had to fight through that and be innovative on how you were going to resolve it, because at the end of the day, patients can't have their medicine, their medical regimens disrupted. So there were quite a number of challenges that come into play for due to the pandemic, but they also become what we call business as usual, part of not as usual, but part of how you have to approach it. It's not a one-off. It is,
Yeah.
how do you deal with risk in your supply chain, no matter where it is?
Yeah. Have to do it all at the same time. Absolutely. So let me turn to Kirsty and from Diageo, and um, your company. You in the same notion of thinking about reporting on this and in your supply chain. You have you you're disclosing to the TCFD framework, and but you've said, and I think this is really interesting and important, you've said that we know that we can't separate climate change from other issues like water stress and biodiversity loss and poverty and inequality, and they're closely linked, and they threaten communities and the environment both. It's a beautiful statement, and I say more about that, because that's the essence of supply chain management. It's landing somewhere. It's in a community, and you can't look at it in one dimension. And so, yeah, share more about that.
So yeah, thank you. It's definitely not one dimensional, and I think we're very cognizant at Diageo. You can't make a drink without water. Okay, and so that's the reality of it, and it is also there is a moral responsibility that we shouldn't be making drinks if people don't have enough water to wash and for sanitation and for health purposes and to cook with or to water their food crops with. There's a moral responsibility there, and I think certainly for us connecting this to the pandemic, it became very clear that it was washing and that access to clean water was more important for communities than having a nice beer in their hand or having another nice gin and tonic in their hand in certain parts of the world. So I think the sentiment that we feel is that climate change will be a major disruptor for decades to come, and there needs to be some transparency from business so that we know where that action is being taken, and it's about that collaboration across not just across industry sectors but also about society, and so that we can work together to address and adapt to climate risk as it comes along. And that's why we feel there is no separation for us with the impacts of climate risk on and climate change on us as a business, and that of the communities and the societies that we wish to sell our products to, or
Yeah.
that we're making our products with. Right? We're all in that same space together, and that's
Yeah.
very clear to us, and that's why for us there's a very strong connectivity with our climate risk program plus our Society 2030 program, which is our sustainability program. The two things are very,
Mhm.
very strongly connected.
Let me turn to
Mm.
Lou. Lou, when we talk about opportunities in the climate sensitive economic sectors, how you could look at that anyway. You could look at that as a response. You could look at that as opportunity. however you want to. FM Global, your perspective, you've said um, that the pandemic has resulted in companies taking a harder look at their raw materials and components, especially in the manufacturing sector, and like there are big risks that are playing out in raw materials. Let's just talk specifically about that. I think that's really, really important. Especially in the vein of the biodiversity and the water, and as we get, and then you throw COVID on top. Like, yeah, tell us about that.
Right, sure, Kathy. Thank you. Yeah, I think there's kind of two major facets that are at play here. The first is, we have this combination of a mix of labor from the pandemic, or shortage of labor from the pandemic, and then the physical climate risks that are starting to become increasingly evident, like flood and drought. And those two combine to really stress supply chains. And a great example of this is just last year, the floods in Western Europe affected the transport of steel, which not only affected the steelmaking industry, but all of the domestic appliances and everything that depends on it. So that's the first immediate kind of near-term facet that's becoming increasingly visible. It has a lot to do with infrastructure, and sometimes that can be a blind spot. The second facet is this notion of the longer term ESG and sustainability goals. How are companies really meeting that that's right for their sector? Manufacturing, in terms of their energy and the transportation of their products, are right in the middle of that. And they need to have an eye on how they're doing that. And I think that's being increasingly motivated by the visibility of these more extreme events that are posing risk to the climate across that sector and all the sectors that depend on it.
Yeah, good, good, good. Well, let's talk about reporting for a minute. Chris, you've said that you don't really see reporting on risk management as a competitive differentiation. There are all sorts of reporting frameworks, and that we're all doing them, and we all need to, and that they're no longer differentiating. Can you talk about that a little bit? That space has changed quite a bit in the last 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm kind of talking a little bit from a perspective of someone who wrote their first sustainability report in 2004.
Yeah.
If I think I'm kind of in violent agreement with some other recent contributors to Economist events like Bill Gates, like Jennifer Grenville Howard, and like Deloitte UK's corporate reporting leader Veronica Poole. And I think the kind of standard reporting now is massively improved and is really developing a new level of maturity. And I think we often hear this discussion over, reporting and metrics. And I think there's some key aspects that we need to kind of unpack there to sort of get away from this competitive reporting or who's got the best reporting, and unpack that, to a certain extent, we talk about better reporting, but I don't think anyone's kind of clear on what that North Star is. What does the metrics, the right metrics to be report look like? And very often, as you mentioned, Kathy, there's lots of standards that are out there, but we often see a lot of bespoke reporting being developed as everyone's trying to work out the best way to measure on these ESG factors. At the same time, one point that I think doesn't always get talked about when we're talking about reporting is also capability. As I said earlier, I think the quality of the reporting has improved massively, but as the demand for more and more reporting, more and more insight into ESG, and even trying to develop that at a more regular cadence or a higher level of cadence, that's an incredibly big undertaking for companies to engage in. That we're looking at these digital transformation of businesses and trying to build the metrics into those systems, but it's still, I think, sometimes overlooked that we just think about the end goal of having more metrics, not necessarily about everything that goes below that in terms of actually being able to achieve that. And of course, I know, I'm very aware of on this panel, many of us are representing international businesses here. So, from my work with small and medium-sized enterprises, I know that this challenge on reporting is even more difficult for a company that might not have the resources to kind of build the infrastructure around that. And so I think, as you mentioned, we've got a lot of very strong standards that are already out there, but I still think there's more opportunity both to increase the participation in those standards, be that SASB, be that the making sure everyone meets the IFRS requirements, and also, as you mentioned, TCFD. TCFD climate risk assessment is a key pillar of that. the scenario risk analysis that's recommended through TCFD provides a really good view to businesses in terms of understanding the risks and opportunities that are presented in this field at a very fundamental level of an organization. So I think it's both increasing the people who are using those, but also trying to encourage people to gravitate also towards those standards so that, we make this process efficient as possible. One last point
Yeah.
I'd just like to make on this reporting aspect is to recognize that sometimes we haven't quite got the balance between the metric, but actually what needs to go with that metric, which is all of the articulation and narrative, because ultimately, by its very nature, a measure is a simplification. And so we need to be aware of, being able to build a narrative. And again, rather than thinking about it as a competitive differentiator, we want to provide, fact-based insight. So, because ultimately, when we're dealing with these wide-scale challenges, we're looking at collaborative models working across sectors rather than seeing it in a narrow
Mhm.
competitive mindset.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I worked for Bank of America, and I was global executive for environmental and social risk. And so, in this space, and looking at all of the different reporting frameworks, and I think it's interesting to strike the balance between the many of them, the time that it takes to report to them, and then the actionable strategies that come out of that reporting for a company. And that's a that's a really interesting part of the conversation is how many do you subscribe to? How many FTE do you put to them, and that those reporting does informs which strategies that you have to and to comply or to manage the risk around physical or financial transition risk for TCFD. So this is a really important part of the conversation. Let me ask Lindsell about you've at AstraZeneca you've set a zero net carbon goal, and how in your reporting, but also just pure logistically, mechanically, how does that play out in your supply chain?
Yeah. So, Kath, first of all, I just want to echo a little bit of what Chris said. So,
Right.
it's an interesting point about it's not truly in a place of competitive nature for the reporting, right? I do believe
Mm-hmm.
there's a level of accountability that the reporting does help
Mm-hmm.
across segments, across within segments. But the other point that I'll bring up here is that when we start to seek connectivity throughout an entire value chain, these metrics will be important because we need to be able to see our suppliers and our suppliers and where their risk may be. So there's some standards and principles that I think Chris was talking about that really show up as you think about how to have a full view
Mm-hmm.
across supply chains. For us, we have a $1 billion program on Ambition Zero Carbon here. We're truly proud of that at AstraZeneca, and we're starting to work forward on it. And we are actually making really good progress. We're on track. So our program is to be net carbon zero for our internal sites by 2025, and then our extended network and value chains a 50% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030, and then by 2045 to be 90% reduced.
Mm-hmm.
That's the ambition. When you ask how that has evidenced itself in our supply chain management, first of all, it becomes, do you know where your risks are? So there's two sides of it. One is the reactive measures of trying to understand where your risks are and are you mitigating those risks. But we're talking about the longer net carbon ambitions of changing to renewable energy, to look at our product space. We're looking at business travel. We're switching to electric cars by 2025. And then we will continue that expansive view. We've created a roundtable within healthcare. We know that healthcare is about 4% of the global carbon emissions. So how do you make sure that within the management of your supply chains across an industry segment, you have the right connections? So it's forcing us to think truly differently about how our facilities are run and managed, how we power our vehicles, how we manage ourselves within a network. It goes back again to, do you integrate this into all of your practices where possible? So when we bring on a new investment, when we bring on a new supplier, we will have the criteria for the carbon assessments within that new investment or that new agreement with that supplier. So you want to connect your value chains, and you want to do it as part of your business as normal, business as usual.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
as if you can integrate that, then you put yourself in a really, you put communities and the corporations in a better place.
That's great. Thank you. Let me turn to Kirsty, and let's just get back to, your dependency on water and your supply chain. You've made some commitments, and say more about that, if you will. You've said that we've committed to reduce the amount of water we use in our drinks on average by 30% and 40% in water-stressed places by 2030. That's ambitious, and just tell us about that. That's very specific and essential to your business, clearly.
Yeah, it is. You're absolutely right. And as I said before, you can't make a drink without water. So that's what's always front of mind for me. It really is. And so I think that we, as part of our climate risk assessment programs, we have also done a global water stress assessment across all of our sites. So we have 150 sites spread across 60 different countries. And many of those are in water stressed areas. We are also not. We're also, because of the nature of the provenance of the profit of the products that we make, it's not easy to move the production of those products. So tequila must be made in Mexico and in a certain part of Mexico. Scotch must be made in Scotland, and Guinness, Irish Guinness, must be made in Ireland. And some of those are water stressed, and some of those are not so water stressed. But it does mean that we need to be very cognizant of what we're looking at in there, and what people expect from us to do. So you talked about our commitment. In addition to the amount of water that we're using to make our products, we've also promised to replenish more water than we take. So particularly for those water stressed communities, so that they're not short of water from our business activity. I talked about that before. This is a shared responsibility. We can't be making beer, and we can't be making premium spirits if the communities that we're working in and around don't have enough water for themselves and their own lives. And so in the last couple of years, we have indeed replenished more water than we have taken, and we will continue to do that, and not just in water stressed areas. And it goes the previous speaker was talking about it before, really about going down your value chain. It's not just about us and our operations. It's also about moving it beyond. I mean, the reality is we're an agricultural products company. We take wheat and barley and local products like sorghum and sugarcane, and we make premium spirits from them. And so, what we need to be doing is building that climate and water resilience with those raw material suppliers, and making sure that we work with, for example, we have hundreds of thousands of smallholder farmers that we work with across the world. This is not in some situations we are buying commodities through huge commodity supply chains. In other cases, we are buying from smallholder farmers. And so we've made a commitment that we will help them to become more water resilient, and to really contribute to mitigating this risk of climate change on all of us.
Yeah, that's great. Really, really concrete and clear. So let me turn to Lou, and let's look at a slightly different aspect of it, which is reliable infrastructure, and thinking about thinking about they're not just opportunities. Again, this is responding to risks and responding to how you best prevent or you ensure business continuity. Can you talk about the role of reliable infrastructure in the way that you're looking at your supply chain management and risk management?
Yeah, sure, Kathy. Thank you. I think there is this responding. Ideally, the strategy would be more proactive than that. And one of the things that companies often don't do is they don't look outside their own four walls and look at
Mhm.
where is their water coming from, where is their power coming from. Now, internet is critical infrastructure. Let's face it. I mean, we can't function without functioning internet. So where are those things coming from? And how reliable are they? How reliable are they to the kind of low probability, high consequence, major climate related events? How resilient are they to those? And then on the long term, how does that feed up to your ESG reporting? The sources of power are important sources for ESG reporting. And how do you turn that into reporting for consistency and compliance up your supply chain, now to reporting for advantage? And the one piece of that advantage that is starting to hit home now, I think, especially during the pandemic, is the advantage of being able to have a great reputation, of course, because climate risk is more important than ever and it's being increasingly recognized. But secondly, the reputation for your company as a reliable supplier, and maybe even most importantly, the ability for your company to attract the kind of talent it wants.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I would like to do a little bit of ask all of you this question. We have about 12 minutes left, and at the end, I want to give you a minute to think about this. At the end, I'd love to ask a lightning round question in one sentence. What is your approach of your company for managing? Well, for managing a physical risks of climate and COVID. What is the approach that you're taking in a quick sentence that'll help people, help delegates get a quick, short sense of the different ways that you guys are approaching it? So I'll come back and come around on that. But I wanted to ask, the session is about addressing complex risks in your supply chain. And I want to talk about reducing them. And so let me come back around the way that I came and start with Lou. And you said proactively, and I am also in the business of reducing the risks. There's a whole assessing it and assessing what will reduce it and reducing it, and how you finance it and all of that. But I just love to hear each of you talk about in your supply chain, how are you reducing the risks? And I think let's focus on climate in this question. I think that's useful. So Lou, to you.
So the big climate related risks that companies now face, the first one is clearly flood. And second is water and all the things that go along with that, water scarcity, wildfire. Then you start to look at other secondary effects, winds and storms and thunderstorms and hail and those kinds of issues. So the key is to make sure you understand your current risks and you're taking measures to mitigate against them. But the most important thing now for companies to think about and being proactive is to look a longer term scale. In the past, all these natural hazards have been considered to be fairly static. The only changes in our understanding comes from better science. But now we know they're not static anymore. They're changing. So companies are now starting to look across their portfolio and saying, with the changes that are happening in the climate, what are the locations? What are the suppliers? Where's the infrastructure that I need to be most concerned about for major factors around? And I would suggest starting with water. And we do this for our clients as a service. We look at all their locations and give them different scenarios about what could affect them in the future. And that allows them not only to take action now, but to start thinking about how to plan their capital expenses, how to start looking at sorting out different changes in their suppliers, because those don't happen overnight. And really to start doing some longer term planning around what's their company going to look like in a different world in 2030, 2040, 2050.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Thank you for that. Look, Kirsty, let's go to you. You've talked about this a little bit. Let maybe one layer down. Love to hear it.
So I think that when I look at this sort of climate risk is concerning. Yeah, it is unknown to us. It was going to affect us on a personal level. It's going to affect our companies and the society and the communities we work in. And I think the company I work for. So Johnny Walker, which is one of our big brands, celebrated its 200th birthday last year. It was a year of unprecedented disruption within supply chains. And so that level of resilience and agility that we needed to grow within our supply chain to cope with COVID, I think actually, and thinking about having a brand that celebrated its 200th year, its 200th anniversary, and for it wanting to be around for another 200 years, that really helps us see, okay, what is the level of resilience and agility that we need to be able to build for another 200 years of successful brand building. And for me, I think that's one of the most interesting parts of working for a very brand-led company is also our ability to use those brands to talk to our consumers, to really connect with consumers and use the brands to bring climate risk and climate change to life for them in a way that perhaps climate change, I think, can seem very like perhaps it happens to somebody else or somewhere else. It's somebody else's wildfire, it's somebody else's flood. If it's not mine, then I'm not dealing with it, really. I look at it on the news and I feel sad for those people. But when you can use the brand that people go out and choose to celebrate life events with, and you can use that to actually communicate about what does climate risk mean, what does climate resilience mean, what does climate change mean, and what are we doing about it? I think that's where I think these sort of very brand-led companies have this opportunity to connect with consumers and to explore and to help people make the right choices for themselves.
Yeah, I see that. That makes it quite accessible, I have to say. Yeah, that's appealing. Lindsell, how about you? Climate risk reduction in the supply chain. What does it look like for you?
Yeah, for us at AstraZeneca, we're trying to take a pretty systematic approach to it. We've enlisted some couple partners to go and model the 2020-2030 zone of change, the 2030 to 2040 zone. We've then gone through each of our internal sites and hubs and said, well, these 10 sites approximately sit in those zones. And then what do we need to do? For one particular site, we've changed their power structure and taken them off the local grid, have created their own power center with the facility, and then shored up the portable systems that they also have. So we're trying to go into where there's flood or wind or whatever those key zones are and say, if you're in a critical area, how do we actually try to mitigate that situation? We've also partnered with a company that's the conference here to look at our supplier network. If you extend out to our 700 suppliers and then look at the most critical 300 or 50%, where do they sit? What zones are they in? And then start to work with those suppliers to go out and create some collaborative approaches to shore those up, because you either have to shore their capability or you have to find a different supplier to from a business continuity perspective. So there's business continuity and there's actual activities that you take at each of those production nodes within the supply chain to really try to reduce and mitigate your risk.
Excellent. Thank you. Chris, what's happening for you at Dell?
So, I suppose when Michael Dell founded our company, supply chain was one of our original value propositions. So it's always been kind of central to the company. And I think, I don't want to over index on this point on resiliency as it's already been mentioned. But essentially, I think, as part of this discussion and thinking about how the pandemic has impacted on climate risk mitigation, like many sectors, I think it's rather than necessarily change things, it's just accelerated the progress of it. And so, specifically in this resiliency field, this importance of digitalizing the supply chain and being able to see more in a real-time basis, what's happening within the supply chain, obviously provides a lot more opportunities then to kind of make decisions that's going to help the business through when there's potential severe weather events and other aspects. I think at the same time, what we've kind of always championed, and I'm seeing it increasingly happen across many other sectors, especially as we start coming together to consider the impacts of regulations like the EU Sustainable Corporate Governance proposals, is the fact that this greater engagement with suppliers, putting resiliency not just on the kind of traditional supply chain metrics like quality and continuity of supply, but also putting it with things like social and environmental responsibility. I mean, a responsible supply chain also tends to be the most resilient one. And so taking that opportunity to then have closer engagement and collaboration with suppliers. And we've spoken on this session about, our SBTI targets and scope 3. I mean, let's be frank. I mean, in order to make the huge changes that we want to make, we're not going to be able to do that on our own. And so, especially in terms of some of these climate risks like energy supplies, it's so important for companies to work closely with their suppliers to build the market signal so that the capacity is filled with the type of renewable energy that we're all sorting to try and reduce our own environmental footprints. And so that collaboration point to me is key.
Excellent. Oh, thank you very much. So let me ask you in like 5 to 7 words, each of you to say, what is your company's approach to managing complex risks, climate, COVID, everything related in your supply chain for delegates to take away the top level, top priority as you approach it? And I'll go back around Chris, Lindsell, Kirsty, and Lou. Chris.
So for us, it's really about, digitalization and collaboration. And so using social and environmental standards to drive that resiliency that we all seek in our supply chains.
Super. That's crystal clear. Lindsell.
For us, is business continuity, connectivity, and then how agile are you? How fast can you respond?
Yeah. Kirsty.
So I would look at it in a slightly different way. So I think why we work in this area and why we manage risk is because we would like to have that true definition of sustainable development, which is meeting the needs of the current while not compromising the needs of future generations. And so I genuinely think that this is a shared accountability. And something that I was a trainer was talking to my team the other day was really that you can't share accountability unless the person you want to share it with is willing to receive it. And that's what we're talking about here with this risk management and risk communication that we're talking about here, is sharing accountability and helping others to receive that accountability so we can all move forward together into a better future.
That's a really important insight. I hope everyone heard that one. That's really insightful. Yeah, I like that. Lou.
Yeah, as a mutual company, it really focuses on our clients doing 3 key things: addressing their current risks, physical risks. There are tons of solutions out there, making sure they address those risks in the future and have good, sound ESG principles that don't introduce new risks. And finally, telling their stakeholders and employees about it.
Great. So I'm going to wrap up our session and say thank you to the speakers for your insightful perspectives, really bringing some new views to this and weaving it all together at the same time. I am going to make a pitch for a risk that is very little talked about, and that is heat. Heat as a stress and heat as a shock. And heat is killing more people than any other climate-driven hazard, 20 times more people in the US than hurricanes. And it is a supply chain risk, and would love to talk to you all about that. Want to put it on the table. So Chris Edery, Lindsell Harris, Kirsty McIntyre, and Lou Gritzo, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you also to the audience. Stay tuned for the next session, and it will start shortly. Thanks so much.